Hello friends, welcome back to Play Chess. Nice to see you again, and I hope you've been studying your chess books and your notes at home. Now, we've come so far in this series that we've discussed your elementary mates right up through all the tactical possibilities that you can pull off in the game. What we want to do this evening, as a teaser, is introduce you to positional chess, strategical chess. Now, I understand that this is more advanced and it doesn't pertain particularly to the frame of reference of this course, but I want to give you a taste of what positional chess is all about. And we're going to do this by studying a specific opening. Now, I've been getting some feedback, and I understand a lot of you are wondering, how do I start the game? What do I do in the game? Well, we have been showing you the ideal positions about getting your pieces out, developing them very quickly, putting them towards the center, castling early. But how to go about this is a question that stays with you. So we shall discuss a specific opening this evening, and at the same time I'm going to show you how a master studies an opening and what are the considerations that he has in mind. We must remember when we're studying positional chess something that's very basic. For example, in any chess position, you have something like 38 to the 84th power possibilities of chess moves. Now, you realize how much that is. It's astronomical. That's 38 with 84 zeros following it. That's the number of variations possible at any chess position in the mid-game. This has been calculated, by the way, by the chess computer champion of the world, known as Bell, put out by Bell Laboratories. Now, it's obvious from this number of situations that are possible that a human being is not able to go through all these possible variations. It would take millions of years if a computer went through these at the speed of light in order to cover all these variations. So even a computer nowadays is not capable of figuring out the number of variations from any position. So the way computers are arranged, they have cutoff points. In other words, they will think for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 11 minutes, and then they'll cut off, and they'll choose the best variation that they have thought of up till then. That's for a computer. How much more difficult it is with mere mortals. We can't possibly use the system of brute strength analytical thought. In other words, the brain is capable of analysis. The chess computer is capable of the same type of analytical brute strength. But the chess computer and the brain is not the mind. It takes the mind to make and discover abstract principles involved. And it's the principles with which we're concerned. Knowing the principles that have arisen out of the study of chess theory that gets us through the myriad variations that are possible in any position. So whereas a computer would study at great length all the variations, and many variations that a human wouldn't even bother looking at, because the human goes according to certain principles. And if variations don't fall within those principles, they're just ignored. So let's discuss positional chess by discussing some of the basic principles that are involved in an opening game. We'll look at our board over here, and we'll discuss the double king-pawn openings. The double king-pawn openings are such. Now, naturally, they're very strong opening moves because they open both the queen and bishop on both sides. They attack center squares, and they allow for quick deployment of the pieces. They're your double king-pawn openings. Now, forgetting the pieces alone, what white is going to try to do in this type of an opening is going to try to remove the king pawn the black king pawn from its position. It usually does this by a thrust pawn to queen 4, forcing pawn takes pawn at some point. Now the resulting position of pawns after that pawn is taken back, white has a pawn on king 5, black usually ends up with a pawn on queen 3. Now this pawn structure is what usually comes from our double king pawn openings, and it's very advantageous for white. The reason being, white has control of the center squares d5 and f5. They are great outposts for the pieces, especially for the knights. White has to make use of this advantage by using all the tactical know-how that he has and that we have studied to place outposts on these squares. In other words, it's not enough to have the advantage. You have to make use of the advantage. You have to play in an aggressive style. So double king pawn openings usually result with pawn having the advantage. The two center pawns are a knight's distance apart, but white has the advantage by control of the center squares. So let's return to our basic position, and we shall develop a knight towards the center, which is attacking the center square. The opening we're choosing, black does the same thing, opens a major piece, attacks central squares, defending this pawn. And now the bishop comes out to b5, or queen knight 5. This move is what signifies the start of a specific opening system which is called the Roy Lopez, which I'll write on the board. The Roy Lopez. If you have books at home, you can look it up and study that. Interestingly enough, the Roy Lopez was first discovered in the Göttinger Handschrift, which was written around the year 1490. But it wasn't until 1561 that a Spanish clergyman by the name of the Roy Lopez from Safra, Estremadura in Spain, did an analysis of it. And from that analysis, we have our very first beginnings of in-step study of this specific opening system. I mention that to show you how archaic our game is and how early on it has been studied. However, the system was really analyzed in depth by Janisch, the great Russian master, in the mid-1800s. It is today considered probably white's strongest continuation. And let's look at why it is considered such. Right away, the white bishop is attacking this knight, which removes the defense of this pawn. So if this knight is taken, this pawn is under attack. But please note that tactically, the pawn cannot be taken immediately. For if the pawn is captured immediately, the queen comes out attacking both knight and pawn. The knight has to back off and the pawn is taken back. So it's a feigned attack, but it's the threat that counts. Although the bishop will not take immediately because the queen being able to come out and win back the pawn, the threat remains, the initiative remains with white, that this pawn remains vulnerable because of this exchange. From this point, we have several systems of defense for black. And these systems broadly can be classified into certain categories, and we find these same categories in different opening systems. We have, for instance, the strong point defense. In other words, king 4 or e5 is going to be maintained by black. That's known as the strong point defense. Then we have the counterattack. If he takes me, I'll take him. That's the other system of defense, known as the Berlin defense in this specific opening, the counterattack. We have the classical defense, which is known as the Cordell variation. And we have the modern waiting defense, which Paul Morphy, the great young American, started by going pawn to queen rook 6 and forcing the white bishop to move. It's a waiting move. If the bishop moves back here at some time or other, it can be chased away by this. So that becomes a very handy waiting move. Let's look at them again now. We have the strong point defense, favored by such players as Steinitz. We have the Berlin defense, which is a counter-attacking defense. And we have the classical Cordell defense, which fails really because white gets a broad pawn center and forces the, even with this taken, forces the bishop away. And white ends up with a strong center. So the best defense that chess players have come up with so far is the waiting move known as the Morphy defense to the Roy Lopez, the pawn to A6. White then moves back, maintaining the pressure on the knight. Now, here again, let's look at another possibility. What happens if white plays the exchange variation and goes bishop takes knight? Pawn takes. Now you notice by taking the knight, white has willingly allowed black 2 free diagonals for the bishop. Now here are some positional characteristics which are arising out of the opening immediately. White then plays pawn to queen 4. Then after pawn takes pawn, removing this central pawn, and queen takes queen, queen takes queen, and knight takes queen. Let's study this position. This is the position which arises in the Roy Lopez after the exchange variation. This position, the great Emanuel Lasker considered to be very favorable for white. Let's try and understand why, and we'll learn something about positional chess. First of all, white is well developed. Will not take long to castle, whereas black will take many moves to castle. But there is a drawback. The drawback is that both of black's bishops are free, whereas in other variations of the Roy Lopez, the black bishops have trouble becoming free. To offset the freedom of the 2 bishops, white has 4 pawns on the king side, and black only has 3. Therefore, the king side majority of pawns in the end game could tell the difference in the game. 1 pawn will sneak through to become a queen for one of your basic mates. This is what black has to be wary of. Whereas on the queen side, please notice that the 4 pawns of black meet the 3 pawns of white. 3 pawns are holding up 4 because the bishop pawns are doubled. Doubled pawns, another positional characteristic, are a weakness because the double pawns reduce a pawn majority to invulnerability because they're held up by 3 pawns. Now, this exchange variation is favorable for white, although Steinitz thought that the 2 bishops were stronger than the inherent weaknesses in black's position. But such arguments go on through history, and they go on from player to player right through chess time. And it's very interesting to see what new players come up with and how to deal with the middle game that comes out of these openings. We'll set the position back up. We'll play through the Roy up to the point we left it, the Roy Lopez, central occupation, and the bishop out here. Now the exchange variation we showed you allows white to be centralized, and we've just looked through that position. If after this, instead of the exchange variation, white moves back to A4, keeping this possibility in mind. Now black can play again the strong point defense. But it's very dangerous because of this pin. You notice the pin is now absolute. The knight cannot move because of the check. So here we have tactical motives involved in positional chess. What white would do in this case is an immediate thrust in the center, force exchanges, and this knight being in a bad position. That's what the Steinitz defense. Another possibility is the Cordell variation again, which is disbanded nowadays as being too weak. But the counterattack is considered quite strong. Now this knight is developed to a central square and attacking this pawn. The usual position here, strange as it may seem, would be for white to castle immediately. The reason being positionally. White wants to get the rook on this file. If black were to take this pawn, this file becomes very dangerous with the rook on it because of the exposed king. And it will take time for this king to be able to castle because the bishop is still in. So white castles, and now we have an option. We come to a separating of the waves in the theory of the Roy-Lopez. We have the counterattack, which is known as the open game. And you can see why it's called open, because the central pawn of white's is missing, and the game will become blown wide open. That's the open defense, the open game of the Roy-Lopez. By the way, the Roy-Lopez in some books is referred to as the Spanish game. Most books either refer to it as the Roy-Lopez or the Spanish game. After castling, we have the open game and we have the closed game. In the closed game, problems are completely different. Black remains cramped, castles early, defends the pawn, develops, but is cramped. It's a different style of game, and really, depending upon the style of player you are and what mood you're in, you'll choose one over the other. Let's look what happens at the open game and discuss some of the strategy involved. Knight takes pawn. Now, we'll push our middle pawn right away, the idea here being to remove this pawn so that this file becomes open for the rook. Especially if the knight is caught on it, the knight will be caught unable to move because of the king being behind it. Now, black would like to come up here and help pin and help support this knight. But he can't do it as long as this bishop is threatening an absolute pin because of the check. Again, we see how our tactical motives play their role in strategical chess. So black will remove the possibility of that pin first, chasing the bishop away, and then he'll be able to come up here, support the knight, block the bishop. White will then get his pawn back. They're both a pawn. They both have pawns. The force or the pieces are even. And black then can develop this to prevent this pawn from pushing and also to allow a possible attack up here backed by the queen. Also to provide an escape for the bishop in case this knight comes here. So that's a very functional move. And it supports d4 in case a piece comes to it. Now, black has a problem here, and it's a very interesting position positionally to study. Black will come up here, develop a piece, double up on the protection of this pawn, which is being attacked by the queen and the bishop. That is now stable. Let's look at this position now and see what characters we can decipher positionally and what we can learn out of this position. First of all, let's look at the pawn structures. White's pawn structure is pretty normal, except this pawn might be a little overextended, although it thrusts itself into the enemy camp, doesn't allow the enemy to put pieces on squares that are right within the camp. but we have to be careful that it's protected. This pawn's a little out of position, but it allows the retreat of the bishop and the pile-up on this knight. But let's look at black's pawn structure. This is where we get an inkling into positional chess. These pawns have been developed almost willy-nilly. This pawn remains what we call backward. These pawns are in good position. This bishop has to be developed fairly shortly in order for castling to be produced and a sound position. But the great weakness here is the weakness of the pawn on c7. The pawn on c7 would love to be up here, you see. Pawns in the avant-garde of the pawn skeleton call for the stragglers to come up and be alongside of it. Two pawns in the lead are called head duos. Here we have a triplet. So this black will try to remove this knight, advance this pawn, and then get a menacing queenside attack with the pawn front. White, on the other hand, will try positionally to keep this pawn backwards. And if white, after this move, let's move here. We're in another position, but we're just going on. And now, if white can trade off both these knights on d4 by moving to d4 so that there's a trade-off here, and this pawn eventually ends up here, it will solidify his pawn structure and give him an open file attacking the backward pawn. Now, what do you do with an open file that has a backward pawn on it? What you do is you put your rooks on it, double your rooks on it, and go for the attack on the backward pawn. You follow that? Let me show you how it may work. After a position like this knight will come down here, and, oh, this is still here. Now we're piling up on this knight. The knight will move over here. And then this knight may move like that. The idea being now to get both knights to jump into here, to be a general trade-off, and ideally the position will end up like this. Positionally, white has a one game. Positionally, white has a one game because this pawn cannot advance here now without some threat. This bishop may come up here to stop the pawn from coming. This bishop will move away. The queen will come up. The rooks will double up and infiltrate on what we call the half-open file, attacking that backward straggler. So a master studies his chess opening based upon the ideal opening of getting your pieces out to center squares as fast as possible, but at the same time he's looking for structural weaknesses in the pawn structure and how to take advantage of them. And this is, in the open game of the Roy Lopez, this pawn becomes a straggler and becomes a target that black can come and infiltrate or attack and win. Some of the positions which arise from the open defense of the Roy Lopez. And we notice how we carry out our positional aims through tactical means. The pin, the fork, all these things we've studied, the overworked piece. We use all these tactical maneuvers to carry out our positional aims. Let's set up the Roy Lopez again and look at the other defense. Now, instead of taking this pawn, which is the open game, he plays the closed game. Now, black would like to take this and then take this pawn. But he can't do it until this pawn is protected again because of the queen coming up. So he immediately moves his rook over. Now that the rook is moved over, this exchange is viable. If you don't follow that, Play the Roy Lopez over at home several times and you'll see what I mean. This has to be pushed away now. Has to be pushed away. Pawn comes up. This is a strong point defense, right? The strong point defense. Black is going to play a closed, restricted game. Again, this is a very good maneuver because it allows a pawn push in the center, prepares a bridge for a head duo, a positional turn, a head duo. Moves up here, black can castle. White has time to move this pawn up, which prevents a pin, you see, and allows this bishop to be mobile. Now what we do after a position like this is we push in the center. Now black can get this pawn up. He first pushes this pawn back, moves this pawn up, like so. This knight moves back, and the queen comes up here. Now let's look at the queen and the pawn, strong center. We're playing a strong defensive center. Now what I wanted you to understand from using the study of the Roy Lopez is that we use the tactics that we have learned to carry out positional themes in our game. Now the positional themes continue on throughout the game and through the middle game, even go into our end game. But we use tactics to carry them out. And some of the positional themes I've described are backward pawns, double pawns, open files, quick development, and cramping. Now I hope you've learned something. This is just an inkling to whet your appetite to go further in the study of positional chess. I'll see you next time.